I'm Michael Bungay Stanier. This is Change Signal, the podcast where we cut through the blather, the BS, and the noise to find the good stuff that works in change and transformation. Now, about every month or so, I run a LinkedIn Live workshop where I teach a model or a framework that I find to be foundational to being a successful change leader and agent. So, as an aside, follow me on LinkedIn so you don't miss the next one. In the episode you might have listened to with Charles Conn, he talked really convincingly about the uselessness of plans and the importance instead of small experiments. And this is from an ex-McKinsey guy. So this is a recording of my LinkedIn Live. It's a solo episode, and it's me digging into the power of small experiments. I'm hoping to build your and your organization's capacity to actually manage the change in these turbulent times. So welcome to all of you. I've had a couple of guests on the podcast recently that have talked about the power of small experiments. And it's really occurred to me that this just needs to be a core component of any approach to change these days. And I don't think many of us think about managing change programs or being part of a change experience as my job here is to run experiments, but I'm going to do all I can to make the case that experiments are where it is at. So I've been in the world of change for 30 years, maybe a bit longer now, really since I started my career. I started in the world of innovation and creativity. That's my first job when I finally got out of university. I really enjoyed that work, but we weren't very good at it. We didn't successfully launch very many things. At a certain point, the two notches I had on my belt was a very small role in stuffed crust pizza for Pizza Hut and a very small role in what has been called the worst single malt whiskey ever invented. And that's when I knew that I probably had to move on because I didn't want those to be my career highlights. And I actually moved into change. I actually joined a change management consultancy, as they were adorably called at the time. What is this about? How do you do successful change? And I was reading people like Cotter and Shine and all these kind of gurus in this space. And even now, I remember reading in a magazine, I think it might have been HBR, but I can't remember, what felt like an honest assessment of how this leader approached change. And this is what he said. He said, look, we pick a target and we run like hell towards it. And we get as close as we can. And then we stop and we look around and then we pick another target and we run like hell towards that. And I was like, that feels true. That feels actually of the essence of what it means to actually be in the swirl of change in a way that often these kind of more ordered, more planful, more here are the 7 steps don't feel as real. And that stuck with me. And if it was true then, it feels even more true now. You know, when I grew up, we used to call it change management. And I mean, it's a delusion to think the way we can approach change is through management. Because management sounds like you set out a decree, here it is, you set out a vision, you lay out the steps, you neatly follow the steps, you gently cross the finish line, everybody applauds politely, and your change project is done. I'm not sure about you, but I'm pretty sure that that's nobody's experience right now. Look, we want Google Maps. We want to be able to just type in a destination and it's like, well, here's the fastest option. And if you need a coffee, here's a little detour. We want Google Maps, but actually what we're faced with is orienteering. I've actually only done orienteering once or twice in my youth, but the way I think of it, it's more like a quest, more like a kind of adventure. I imagine myself standing on a mountain. On the horizon, in the distance, is another mountain, maybe like out of The Hobbit. Mighty, snow on the top. But in front of me is not a path. In front of me is a misty valley. And there is no path. There are only trees. There are only shrubs. And I'm like, I'm not quite sure how to get through the valley. I'm not even sure what's in the valley. I'm not sure if there's a swamp or a river or a troll or another dragon. Who knows what's there? I'm not even sure if that mountain is actually the target. It just feels like it might be the target. And I've got to figure out how to get from where I am now to where I think the end point might be. And I really would love a map. But maps are not the territory. Maps are wrong. And especially when we're in a process of change, which is literally moving forward into the unknown, leaving the known behind and moving forward into the unknown. And just last night, actually, I went and saw a guy, a Toronto academic and writer, speak. I'm going to hold up his book. It's called The Explorer's Gene by Alex Hutchinson. And I've only read some of it. I only got it last night, but I love what I've read. And one of the things that he talks about is he says, look, there's an academic called James Match from Stanford, who in 2019 wrote a paper around, or maybe 2009, wrote a paper around the difference between the need to explore in organizations and the need to exploit in organizations, and how you need both of these things. An ability to go out and be playful and run experiments and step into the unknown, and the need to kind of make a commitment, make the most of it, be ruthlessly efficient, ruthlessly practical. And the finding in that research was, organizations' MO are to exploit, and they underinvest in explore. So what we are up against when we are trying to run our change projects, and even running change projects doesn't feel like the truth of it, when we are trying to build change capacity in our organization and trying to see the many initiatives and see if we can make some of them, plant them and nurture them and have them thrive, what we have is the truth of change, which it is a step into the unknown, and the fact that the organizational culture almost certainly is, hey, let's be efficient, let's be practical, let's exploit this, let's do this without making many mistakes. And there's the tension you have as somebody who is involved in change. And one of the things that gives me hope is that one of the names that gets quoted most often in leadership literature is the author of Good to Great, Jim Collins. Some of his research hasn't stood the test of time, but that man is pretty masterful at coming up with a metaphor or three. And one of the metaphors he has, not in the Good to Great book, but one of the ones that sound like Good to Great but follow it, is he says, look, a strategy needs to fire bullets and then fire cannonballs. And the bullets are the small test to figure out actually where the real target is. So low cost, expendable, low risk tests. And then when you figure out where the target is, you need to fire the cannonball. You need to actually kind of commit. And actually, this is a great metaphor for explore and exploit. And what Collins says, I hope this is actually something you can use to persuade the people around you, which is, like most people, when thinking of strategy, when trying to get stuff to happen, they just don't fire enough bullets. And what it means is when they fire the cannonball too soon. And they waste resources, and they waste effort, and they waste all of the equity you have in relationships and whatever else by firing too soon at the wrong target. Or he says what happens is people don't fire the cannonball at all. They don't commit. They don't actually, once they've identified the target, they don't actually go for it. And I think what's joyful about small experiments as a mantra, as a philosophy, is that it allows you to fire bullets and then fire cannonballs. So you get to use that twin dynamic that is present in organizations, which the need to explore and the need to exploit. I'm kind of doing the creativity thing with my hands, which is explore, going out, exploit, focusing in. Explore, firing bullets, going out, where's the target? Cannonball, focus, exploit, kind of targeting in. So what makes up a small experiment? What are the characteristics of a small experiment? Well, I've been thinking about that. I've got some opinions. I still remember burning my eyebrows off using a Bunsen burner in the chemistry lab in my high school. So I'm not sure I'm necessarily the best person. I wouldn't call myself a student at chemistry or physics. But I'm going to give you the 3 books that I think I've found to be most useful to think about this. So 3 kind of resources if you'd like to go deeper. The first is by Jennifer Garvey Berger and Keith Johnson, and it's called Simple Habits for Complex Times. I just interviewed Jennifer 2 days ago for the podcast. The episode's not out yet, but it's a barnstormer. It's really getting into what complexity is and how to actually deal with complexity in our organization. The Alex Hutchinson book, I've read a quarter of it. So I can recommend one quarter of it. It's not going to be quite as connected to what it means to do stuff in organizations. So call this an adjacently helpful book. A third book, and possibly where I first heard the idea of small experiments, is Immunity to Change by Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy. Now, I do love that tool. I don't love that book. It's a bit big and it's a bit long and it's a bit academic. And they're not as good on the small experiment side as they are on the immunity to change process, but that's interesting if you want to get into it. And then this book I really loved. It's called The Imperfectionists by Robert McLean and Charles Conn, ex-McKinsey guys. Charles Conn I happen to know because he was the warden at Rhodes House when I was a Rhodes Scholar there. He's a really brilliant thinker, and they've helped lots of big organizations navigate change. And this is an excellent book on what it means to abandon the old ways of strategy and old ways of change and embrace what's required in these chaotic times. Let me talk to you about what are the characteristics of a small experiment. The first one, and I love this, I got this from Jennifer's book, is it needs to be doable. So often we define experiments in kind of vague, jazz handy sort of ways. To give you maybe an obvious example, which is like, let's do culture change. And I'm like, how do you do culture change? I don't know. I don't know how I do that. So you've got to define something that is actually practically doable. And a key insight, I think, around that is it's probably smaller and faster than you think. What's really seductive in this space is we go, I like the idea of a small experiment. And then effectively you just create the same plan you had before and then call it an experiment. But actually it needs to be much tighter, much faster, much more containable than you think. Keep shrinking it down. And you want to shrink it down enough, but not too far, because what you need to do is actually run an experiment that actually tests on a hypothesis. Like you want to have an idea about, I think this might be an approach, this might work, and you want to test that, which means you must be about gathering data and gathering feedback. If you're running an experiment and it doesn't actually throw off information for you that you can then that's useful information that you can then react to and make a decision of more of that or less of that, it is not a good experiment. This is definitely one of the harder things about designing a small experiment, because a big part of us wants to design an experiment that solves the problem. And actually what you're doing is you're firing bullets. You're not trying to hit the target. You're firing bullets to gather data, which is like, is this promising? Is this not promising? What is this telling me about this as an idea, a tactic, a group of people to work with, language we might use, a pace at which we might be moving? So fundamental to this is what people call a safe to fail experiment. Not a fail-safe experiment, which is the opposite, which isn't even really an experiment. A fail-safe experiment, if you know it's not going to fail, that's not an experiment. It's a safe-to-fail experiment. You have to be building things that may or may not work. And if they don't work, it can't be the end of your career or the end of the career of the people around you. As Mike Abrashoff once said, who wrote a book, I think it's called This Is Your Ship. He's one of those US Navy people who have a good run for 3 years and then spend 20 years on the speaker circuit talking about it. He said, look, there are two types of mistakes, above the waterline mistakes and below the waterline mistakes. And you need to be designing experiments that only will create above the waterline mistakes. So it has to be safe to fail. It has to be like, if this completely goes wrong, will it be a financial cost we can afford? Will it be a time cost we can afford? Will it be a reputational cost that we can afford? Because if it's not, that's not a well-designed experiment. And then I might say as a final point, you want your experiment to be amplifiable, meaning it needs to have the potential to be a cannonball. It has to be the potential to be a cannonball. If you run a small experiment, you're like, well, that was great, but we can only do it with 6 people at a time, then it's actually not that helpful for your overall commitment to change, unless you're running a change project to just change 6 people. So it needs to have that ability to kind of scale as well. So no small thing in designing a small experiment that works well. You've got to figure out what you're testing. You've got to figure out a metric that's actually helpful so that when you get it, you can decide to act on it. You've got to build in a way that it is safe to fail so that you don't, if it goes wrong, and hopefully some of your experiments do go wrong, you can actually learn from that, grow from that, and it won't be the end of yours or others' career. So that's how I would define the kind of characteristics of a small experiment. Let me give you my best guess at some of the strategies around doing that. Because remember, my guess is like many of you are like, absolutely, I love this stuff. This is exactly what I'm thinking. But you're in an organization almost certainly that's designed to exploit, not to explore. So you're in a place where it's actually not that natural to run experiments, certainly not on the change processes that are working within. So I've got some ideas around how you can influence those around you to increase the odds that people will understand and support and encourage your small experiment. So here are some of my strategies. The first, and this is a fun piece of research, would be to send them, and watch this yourself, a TED talk. Maybe it's a TEDx talk, but I think it's an actual TED talk by a friend of mine here in Toronto, Tom Wujek. You can just Google the Marshmallow Tower. And I'll tell you about this because you'll love it. Basically, the quest is this. You have to build a marshmallow tower, and there's a prize for the person or the team who can build the highest marshmallow tower. The thing is, you've got to build the highest tower you can with the spaghetti and the rubber bands and the other kind of tools you have. And it has to be able to support a marshmallow on the top of the tower. So turns out the people who are most successful at that, school kids. People who are like, look, let's just get into it and build prototypes and run experiments and figure out what works. The people who are worst at it, MBA students, because they're like, we need a plan, we need a cost analysis, we need to run the spreadsheet, we need to assign a project manager, and they just never get anything built. So watch that, listen to Tom's talk around the importance of controllable experiments and how iterations get you somewhere faster. This is one of the key insights from the Explorer's Gene book, which is when you run experiments, you are less successful in the very near short term. You are more successful overall because you figure out the best optimized strategies for working on things. So that's the first thing. The second thing might be to say, look, start articulating with the people that matter, the sponsor, your boss, the C-suite, that what you're doing with these experiments is not trying to do a yes, no, test, fail. You're trying to do system sensing or system seeing, which is like we need to understand the system that we're in before we can understand what would work in this system. And it is naive to think you even know what the system is. If you've listened to the podcast episode with Carolyn Webb, one of the early ones, I think, maybe 7 or 8, her key insight is like, look, nobody knows what's actually going on in your system. One of the most powerful things you can do in a change tool is to audit as much as you can about what's going on so you can actually have a more nuanced idea of the landscape. So one way to frame these experiments is this isn't part of the change. This is us sensing and seeing the system as we figure out what will best work in the change. My third strategy, as best I can give it to you, is to use the experimental language that already exists in your organization. Because there's a fair bet that in different places of your organization, there is some of this experimental language. It looks like this. Let's do some A/B testing. Let's have an MVP, a minimum viable product. Let's make some small bets. That's all language that I've heard being used in an organization, but isn't then picked up by the change team to say, we're doing the same thing. We're just running it with our change process. I've got 3 other comments. The first is, in terms of strategies, you need to manage your stakeholders to help them understand what failure is. You got to effectively create the psychological safety for your team, for yourself, for your boss, for your sponsor, to understand that when you run an experiment and it's like, oh, that gave us a result that we weren't necessarily expecting, that people go, yeah, you told us that might happen. If you're looking for an excellent book on this, How to Work with Almost Anyone, a wonderful book by a very, very good-looking author, that would be me, around kind of the conversation about how we'll work together before we start working together. And part of the framing failure is part of that keystone conversation to kind of set up and make practical psychological safety. I would say you should be running more than one experiment at a time. So run a portfolio of experiments. If you're a venture capitalist, and this is a great analogy for us, if you're a venture capitalist, you're looking to make a wide range of bets because you know some will not work, some will be okay, a few will be really successful. So it's a numbers game. The more little experiments that you can run, the more data you're going to gather, the better you're going to sense the system, the more you're going to find your way into what it takes to make things shift around here. And then a second, maybe this is a final comment, which is, and this comes from my soon-to-be released podcast with Jennifer, author of The Simple Habits for Complex Times, Jennifer Garvey-Berger. And she said, look, here's my best technique. I would suggest you run 2 books. She didn't call it books, but I think of it as like a bookkeeper who has the official books that you share with the tax people, and then the unofficial books, if you're the mafia, which is like where the money really goes. I'm not endorsing financial inappropriateness. I'm just saying other people do this. But there's a way to say you might choose to run 2 books. You might need to figure out what the minimum is you do to keep the people who want to see the rational plan being rolled out and tracked in the old school way. You're like, here's my minimum to keep them happy. And meantime, you've got a private book where you're kind of like, and here are the experiments we're running on the side. So you might need to kind of be sophisticated about running that. Here's the kind of the meta insight here, which I hope will be helpful for you. You're trying to make change happen in your organization. You're trying to build change capacity in your organization. I mean, this is one of the things that I've figured out through this podcast, which is, it doesn't matter how good you are or your team is or the plan is or the experiments are or the C-suite sponsorship is, you're trying to build the capacity of your organization to be able to manage the waves of change that keep rolling through. So it's less about you, it's more about how you're building that ability to do that. And within that change capacity, you're trying to build experimental capacity. It's one of the key characteristics of change capacity is, have we got the capacity to run small experiments? And you should bring the discipline and the wisdom and the nuance you have to change to this test itself. So in other words, building experimental capacity is in itself a change process, a change project. That's it. That's our work here is done. And you can sign up for the newsletter at thechangesignal.com. So thank you for being here.